Thank you for tuning in. I'm Stephen Boyce. Welcome to our channel to explore Christianity. Today, we've engaged a new discussion, really a friendly dialogue back and forth between myself and Mark Peralta, who is with Apostate of Mine. And I will bring him in here and let him introduce himself. But this discussion was originally going to be on a different platform. So we kind of last minute put it together here on our channel. And we're going to do the best we can to have a good, friendly discussion between my perspective of the Gospels as a Christian, his perspective of the Gospels, and where he has come to land. So, Mark, thanks for joining the channel and having this discussion. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of where you've been recently with things?
Hey, for sure. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Hello. Can I call you Stephen?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. I'm glad to be here. I've been really looking forward to our conversation, and looking forward to getting to interact with you a little more. I feel like we have very similar backgrounds. So yeah, I'll start with mine. I'm sure your audience knows your background.
Yes.
So I grew up in a Catholic family, growing to Catholic church, Catholic school. But right around the age of 13 or 14, I sort of stopped going to church. But then later as an adult, I started taking a little more seriously. And right around the age of 25 or so, I'm married. And my wife and I, we were sort of like on this journey where we believe, but we're not really fully sold out to the church, but maybe we should start trying it out. And so we did. We went to church together, and eventually, we both went through a whole gospel discovery experience. We accepted the Lord and the Lord Jesus Christ as our Savior, and we proclaimed our faith publicly as we were. I was rebaptized because I was baptized as a baby, but as a evangelical believer, I bought into that as well, and so we did and lived that life for over a decade, maybe. And it was so it was so real to us that, at least for me, I got this motivation, this desire. I refer to it as a calling of the time to actually go and learn more about the scriptures. And I had this passion for teaching. And so I went to Bible college and graduated from Dallas Baptist University with a degree in Bible and biblical studies, along with another degree in, I did a general studies degree. It was both science and biblical studies. I wanted to initially be a dentist, so I was working on prerequisite courses. And then on my senior year, I felt like, I don't know, I don't think I want to go to dentistry. I'm so on fire for the scriptures and theology and all this. And I decided to go to seminary and pursue that degree further. And I went to Dallas Theological Seminary. I was there for like 5-6 years. Initially, I went into, I wanted to learn the languages, and I wanted to translate. But then later I was convinced that, hey, maybe I should just go ahead and do the flagship degree, which is the Master's of Theology. And so I did that. And by graduation, I was already working in ministry. I was picked up by a local sort of a mega church here in the DFW, and worked as an associate pastor for a ministry for about a year, until I was kind of let go. And there's a story behind that, which I won't get into it, but needless to say, I didn't really get back into ministry. By the way, if you're interested in that story, I do have an interview that I did on Myth Vision. It's posted on my channel if you care to learn more about that story. But yeah, I never went back to ministry, but my passion for the scriptures and theology kept on, and I had amassed a little library of textbooks and commentaries while I was in seminary, and so I kept on studying independently. And then gradually came to the realization that I couldn't really trust on the Bible as a divinely inspired word. It all seemed to me like it's just really man-made tradition. And then I started looking deeper into the argument.
Oh,
that was weird.
Yeah, you still there?
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, sir.
Am I frozen?
No,
Okay.
you're clear.
Okay. And so then having evaluated claims in favor of the existence of God a little deeper, not so much as someone seeking the Christian faith or seeking God, but more so as an academic exercise. And it just all seemed to me like I just couldn't really believe anymore. And ever since, I just I kept on studying and learning, and eventually became involved with a group of other thinkers like myself on Facebook. It's a Hispanic community. I'm actually I'm into 5 languages. So one of those is Spanish. I'm fluent. So I joined Nuestra Experiencia Atea, which means our atheist experience, and it's a Spanish community and channel. And there I'm sort of like the Bible guy, and we read through the Bible. Currently, we are learning through Genesis, and we compare Bible translations. I look into the Hebrew, or if we're in the New Testament, we're looking at the Greek text, and so it's been quite the journey. But yeah, that's more or less what we do there. We do critical commentary, and on our podcast, my wife and I, who's also an atheist now, we also do critical commentary of the Bible and the Christian religion, since that's our tradition, and that's in English. And you guys are welcome to join us for you care to see more about what I'm talking about in my channel. So
yeah, and we have your channel in the link if anybody wants to see the link down there at the bottom. We have that for your information to find more out. Thank you for sharing that. And going into, everybody has a journey, and that's something that I've come to realize more and more as I sit down and I talk to people of different persuasions, an atheistic or a skeptical view, is that most people didn't just land there without reasoning and discussion and study. Now, we've all, and this is something that, which is extraordinary about a discussion like this, is probably a lot of the same framework that you studied out, I studied out, and we decided to go 2 different directions with that. And I'm sure we'll get into the specifics of why you went one direction and I went the other direction. But it is quite incredible to me that people can look at the same evidence and come to a different conclusion on the evidence itself. But as it relates to the Gospels today, one of the things that we're going to be discussing is why we land where we land. I believe the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. You would not. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you start, and I'm going to let you share your perspective. And then I'll come in behind and share mine a little bit. And then we'll actually engage some questions back and forth and kind of discuss it. If you're listening, if you're in the audience, feel free to put any questions you might have or thoughts you may have in the comments. And we'll try to take a little bit of time at the end, maybe to engage something that comes in from the audience perspective. Just put that there in the comment and I'll pick it up later and we'll bring it up for discussion.
sounds good. Well, to be clear, I really stand here to challenge the notion, not that the Gospels were not based, or at least that the tradition says, or even the texts themselves today. If you pick up any Bible, any New Testament, you'll see that it does claim to have been based on eyewitness accounts. What I challenge is the reliability of those eyewitness accounts. That's basically where we stand. While these texts are undoubtedly great cultural and have great religious significance, their status as factual accounts of historical events, I believe they must be subjected to serious scrutiny. Now, you might object by thinking that, isn't that a bit excessive? But to be clear, I don't think that everything that's in the Gospels is really worth our time debating. But certainly claims like the miraculous conception of Jesus, the virgin birth, the spirit of a God descending upon from the heavens to testify about Jesus' sonship, the miracles, and most importantly, the resurrection. Those are the claims that I believe would deserve what some have referred to as extraordinary evidence that warrants extraordinary claims that warrant extraordinary evidence. And that's sort of where we stand today. I don't think that I have enough reason to believe that these gospel accounts were actually accurate, even though it says today that they're based on, either the witness testimony or Matthew or John or Mark, as the tradition goes, and so forth and so on. And I have several reasons why I don't have enough trust in them anymore. The first would be that the Gospels were originally anonymous. The earliest surviving copies of the Gospels don't contain any names behind them. We know from tradition that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added to the texts at a later date, possibly to give them greater authority and credibility, but their authorship has been attributed just simply on tradition. And many scholars today do question the reliability of authorship just based on the fact that there are just no early manuscripts that show a name behind them, which some might argue that perhaps that was just not the tradition of the day. But there certainly are a lot of historical documents from the time that do have names behind them. So I think there's a bit of special pleading with regards to the New Testaments. Number two, the Gospels contain inconsistencies. The Gospels contain significant differences in style, content, and even theology, which suggests that they were written by different authors with different perspectives and agendas. For example, the Gospel of John was written in a highly philosophical and theological style, one that reflects more of a Platonic influence on its delivery and content, while the Gospel of Mark seems to be a little more straightforward and focused on action, which some might argue that, they had an intended audience and that's why they're different, but they have enough in common to sort of get them in trouble. And I'll get into that a little bit later. The Gospels were written, number three, they were written long after the events that they describe. Most scholars agree that the Gospels were written several decades after the death of Jesus. The earliest Gospel, Mark, was not written until several decades after Jesus' death, which leaves considerable time for the events to become distorted and misremembered. This also means that they were not necessarily written by eyewitnesses to the events that they describe, but by authors who were relying on earlier sources and traditions. And I think that becomes clear in the Gospel of Luke as being one of those, and perhaps Mark as well, since he was a disciple of Paul, an actual disciple of Jesus. And we'll get to Mark in a little bit. Gospels reflect the concerns of their respective communities. Each gospel reflects the concerns and perspectives of the community for which it was written. For example, the Gospel of Matthew is focused on Jewish concerns and the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, while the Gospel of Luke emphasizes the universality of Jesus' message and the inclusion of the Gentiles, which is not that big a deal. But it's still sort of, I see issues with that, because if these are actual biographies, they ought to be retelling or describing to us historical events without resorting to catering or modifying the meaning or the content to appeal to a certain audience. Number 5, the Gospels contain literary and theological features that are inconsistent with the traditional authors. For example, the Gospel of Mark contains several Aramaic expressions that would be unlikely for a Greek-speaking disciple like Mark to use. Similarly, the Gospel of Luke contains several references to Pauline theology, which suggests that the author was familiar with Paul's letters and teachings, which it seems to be the case. It seems to me, and many scholars, if not most, agree that Paul's letters were written first. And so you have this thing where Pauline theology may indeed be affecting what is supposed to be an eyewitness account. Number 6, theological bias for similar reasons. And I'm almost there. I'm almost done. The writers of the Gospels may have had theological agendas in mind and could have included or excluded details that support their message about Jesus, which may not necessarily be historically accurate. Number 7, miracles. Some skeptics agree that the inclusion of miracles in the Gospels makes them unreliable, as supernatural events are not scientifically verifiable, and as many of them do seem to emulate concepts or ideas or feats of heroes or gods of the Greco-Roman world, making those miracles or those claims of Jesus as really nothing, no novelty, just what everyone was already sort of expecting from the Son of a God. Number 8, lack of external sources. And I'm really big on this one. I was really shocked to find out what is actually said of Jesus or Christianity outside of the New Testament writings. From the historical sources, like Suetonius, we can get into that as well. But I'm not convinced that there's enough to actually corroborate all the events that take place or as they are described in the Gospels. They may provide evidence that there was a character, a historical Jesus, but not necessarily that what occurred in the Gospels was actually true. And then finally, number 9 was Josephus, a source for Luke Acts. Because there seems to be, if that's the case, I'm not so sure. There's no clear evidence that Josephus was a direct source for the author of Luke Acts. However, there are similarities and possible allusions to Josephus's writings in Luke and Acts. For example, there are some similarities in the accounts of the Jewish revolt and the siege of Jerusalem in both Josephus' Jewish war and in Acts. Additionally, some scholars have suggested that Josephus' concept of 2 ways may have influenced the author of Luke and Acts. However, these connections are not definitive, I admit that, and it's difficult to determine the extent to which Josephus influenced the author of Luke and Acts. In short, without tangible evidence and with such discrepancies, mistranslations, and inevitable subjectivity in the Gospels, I believe that we can't not with confidence claim that the New Testament Gospels are reliable eyewitness accounts of historical events. They may do reflect the beliefs of the people that wrote them and the audience to which they were written, perhaps. They don't corroborate historical facts altogether. So in conclusion, I call on you as critical thinker and seeker of knowledge to approach the texts, which is what I've done with a healthy dose of skepticism, and to view them not objective historical accounts, but rather as literary interpretations of the teachings of Jesus from the respective authors' perspectives, and which is my share fascination with you, and I think most of your audience. So.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing your statements there. And I tried to write down as many as I could so that we could have some talking points there. And I'll just give kind of a quick response by sharing my perspective, I guess, of the Gospels as well. So when it comes to the Gospels themselves, I've thoroughly enjoyed looking into the things that seem to be wrong with them. When I first studied the Gospels from a critical perspective, where I was actually open-minded to looking at the evidence of whether or not they really were eyewitness based, does it matter if they are or not kind of situation. One of the things that I started practicing is what some of the ancient historians did when it came to, like, well, how do we know if a author is attached to a certain historical document? And the first thing that you look for is contemporary support, whether you're talking about the Gospels, you're talking about any work of antiquity. And then you take the information that you can find and see how much data has spread over time and how much you can corroborate and put together and find out, where do these stand independently? Where do these stand together? Where do these stand in light of claim? And putting all of those pieces together on a table, looking at them individually. And it's not a small task. It's not something you can do in a few weeks, a month, or even a few years. It takes quite a bit of time to work through all of the synoptic issues alone. And then bringing in John in addition to the synoptic, it really is an endeavor that takes time. But one of those things, three of the things that I look for is that contemporary support, number one. Number two, the information that can be corroborated over time. And then number three, an unbroken chain of custody when it comes to the area of evidence. Like, where do we find consistency where you can build a case and something doesn't come in and ruin it? And this is something that became unique when it came to the Gospels. There was no discrepancy amongst any of the churches in any part of the world that were started by the apostles themselves, because they went into the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where Paul and John spent a lot of time in the area of modern day Turkey, Peter in Antioch and in Rome, Paul also going to Rome, where he died there along with Peter, John Mark going down to Egypt, starting churches in Egypt, and then the North African churches moving down from there. The many churches that were established by the apostles, they had a correspondence back and forth through their bishops, and the bishops began to instruct. We see some of their letters survived antiquity, like Clement of Rome and Polycarp of Smyrna, and then looking at Ignatius on his way to execution with the 7 original letters that he wrote. We start seeing that these churches were connected through bishop relationships, many of which knew the apostles themselves. And they started keeping a chain of custody within themselves, proper correspondence, writings that had known provenances and known authors, and messengers who were respected by both the writer and the recipient, and carrying these messages back and forth on behalf of the apostolic group or an apostle himself. And you see this in many of the epistles. For example, you see the names of the individuals who are being sent back to the churches or sent from the churches with a letter. In response to that, they would write a letter in return and send the messenger back. This is something that was built by the apostles. Why? Because their works were being forged and plagiarized even as they were alive. Paul spoke of people that were coming in with other gospels and other teachings, other doctrines, and he was warning these churches, even if it was a letter in his name, if it was a different message than what they heard in person from him, to anathema, not to let them be a part of their assembly. It's a lie. It's a forgery. Even people were faking his letters to the point where he had to start writing salutations in a certain script, where he was leaving his writings with a certain salutation. Even if he used an amanuensis, he would include his own writing there in that one spot to confirm to the church, this is me, not a plagiarized notion. Even in the earliest collection of a canon that we have, the Muratorian fragment, it recognized that there were forgeries at the very end of the letter. After discussing the Pauline epistles specifically, it said there were other letters attributed to Paul, like one to the Laodiceans, but the churches already knew it wasn't Paul. So the question is how do the churches know or not know of these letters? Well, they had a chain of custody. They had a connection. The apostles started a church and wrote those churches letters. We see this rehashed by their followers. John trained Polycarp, for example, and he wrote to the Philippian church, and he told them to re-examine their view of a certain practice in Christianity on the basis of what Paul wrote them originally. So he's alluding and bringing their remembrance back to, hey, just pull out the letter Paul wrote to you. He told you about this. He told you how to do this. We see Clement, who is trained by Peter and Paul, mentioned by Paul in Philippians. He writes to the same church at Corinth that Paul wrote to, and he told them, Paul told you about falling into sects. You were following Apollos at that time, and some were following Cephas, some were following Paul. He's like, did he not already rebuke you for this kind of conduct in the church? What is Clement doing? He's reminding them of what they already know from a text they already have. The churches were not in the business of receiving anonymous letters. They were in the business of rejecting them. The earliest attestation of the Gospels is consistent. There has never been a claim that somebody other than John wrote the Gospel of John, other than the fact that it could have been a group gospel, which I believe it was. Nobody ever attributed Luke and then another guy like Theophilus himself, or maybe Titus or Timothy. No one ever attributed any other name to Luke's gospel other than Luke. Same with Mark, same with Matthew. Now, there are issues within that. It's not that simplistic. Matthew's gospel seems to have gone through multiple revisions from an earliest stage in one language, transferred over to a larger stage in another language, which I actually hold that position. Mark seems to be writing a sermon for Peter on paper. The people of Rome were clearly, by tradition, worried about Peter's life. And if he died with his sermons, naturally, the message dies with the messenger, unless it is put in a transmittable form, which oral tradition is not good. What's obvious to me is that the apostles themselves did not like the idea of writing. John had to be pushed to get his group to come up with a written account. Mark had to work on behalf of the Roman church leaders to get Peter to approve the work, because Peter was a speaker, not a writer. And that's probably because he was partially literate. He probably wasn't very good at writing. He was probably very elementary at best. John, same thing. They were speakers. They were not writers. That's why you find that others are writing these accounts on behalf of them with their approval and their authority. And the churches knew that through connectivity. So my perspective is that there's multiple facets. In closing, my multiple facets of perspective would be that there are things within the Gospels themselves that would point to on-the-spot eyewitness testimony. I think of what Josephus said about his time in the wars. He said that he was an actor in many of the events, but an observer of most. And that has stuck out to me in how he did his history. And I think that many of the writers of the Gospels were doing the same thing. You can see what I call a direct autopsy taking place in the text. When an alleged writer is involved, which in most cases would only be Mark representing Peter, and then in John's gospel, it'd be John himself. When you see these individuals on the scene, details triple, in some cases go 5 times more in sections where they're just giving an observable moment. And that's what we see distinct between Mark and John specifically versus Luke or versus Matthew himself, is that there's not just observable recordings, there's actually explicit details within that, because these individuals are directly involved in the action. They're there not just as observers, but actually a participant in the scenario itself. And there's multiple places, especially in John, where John seems to actually be kind of competitive with Mark's gospel, specifically being Peter. It's almost like John and Peter have this friendly thing going on to compete in their gospels in a friendly way. Not that Peter was alive when John was doing that, but it's almost like John tried to one-up him on a few things. So there are these fun differences and these fun perspectives that I know that you brought up in your presentation about philosophical style of John, which I think is true. And I think there's an explicit reason and things like that. So my perspective is that these gospels are based on all of the earliest attestation, not just the claims here and there, like sporadic. They're universal, which is why Origen said there's no dispute under heaven about these 4 gospels, because the chain of custody built by the apostles to their disciples themselves had continued these transmitted forms of these texts like the Gospels. And that's why there was never 5, and that's why there was never 3 in any part of the world. They were always the same 4 Gospels in every single church in the world. And they were using the same script on behalf of them, though there are differences in some of the manuscripts, obviously. But within that, there was no dispute. The earliest manuscripts all attribute these to the same individuals that the church fathers were already stating they were attributed to. So in my conclusion, I do believe they are based on eyewitness reports. I do believe that there's a lot of direct autopsy on the scene perspectives, and that there was intentional differences of perspective and audience that led for certain perspectives to be listed in one gospel, not the other, or a different dynamic from one gospel to the other, which I think makes them more authentic, not less, because if they had read all the same the whole time, I'd be very concerned that there was some sort of tampering and conspiratorial work within the gospels themselves. So that's kind of my perspective. I don't know where you would like to start. Is there a specific place, perhaps, Mark, you would like to start? Because I'm sure we gave each other probably 25 to 30 starting points. But is there a specific spot you would perhaps like to jump in on first?
Yeah, sure. So so one of the first things that, I agree with you from the outset is that there is an evident tradition of correspondence between several churches from different locations. And I see that particularly in, within the epistles of Paul. But I don't necessarily see that happening with the gospels themselves. I see something a little differently than you, perhaps, in that the evidence does seem to point towards that there was at least 1 or 2 initial sources, that perhaps that initial source would have been Mark. I think currently I stand behind maybe a 2-source hypothesis, that it would include Mark as a priority, and then there's a source Q, which is primarily sayings of Jesus, which appear and then show up in the different gospels. And in that sense, you do have what, I don't know, maybe perhaps Q is related to the Hebrew Matthew that you talk about.
Sure.
So I wanted to maybe ask you is what evidence do you have of that same correspondence or accountability between churches of, who said what gospel and what's true and what's not, that's actually showing that they're addressing this? And then what evidences do you have for a Hebrew Matthew?
Sure. Well, that's the thing that continually, I guess I can just hone in on Matthew, because that's probably the most asked question I get personally on this Hebrew Matthew. So when you're looking at the evidence, Papias being the earliest, who is trained by John, he was a disciple of John. He states directly, and I agree, by the way, that Mark is the first Greek gospel. I think that he published the first one. But Matthew seems to be this logia that Papias talks about, but he says it was in the Hebrew dialect. Now, if Papias had been the only one that said that, I would say maybe not. But it's interesting. He starts with Mark and then goes to Matthew, but he does not speak of a Greek Matthew. He speaks of a Hebrew dialect Matthew that is just the sayings, the teachings of Jesus, which I think would set it apart from Mark in the fact that the main teachings that were constantly repeated by the early church were certain prayers, the Lord's Prayer. The biggest one is the Sermon on the Mount, and the other big one is the Olivet Discourse. And it seems like that Matthew's gospel was collecting these almost liturgical reading type of statements that Jesus was making. And naturally, the first church would have been in Jerusalem, and they would have been speaking Hebrew Aramaic, one or the other, or both in some cases, probably more Aramaic. So it would make sense if somebody was collecting any source of Jesus, most of which Jesus was probably speaking was in Aramaic in his ministry. Somebody would have collected them in that language or sister language, being Hebrew or Aramaic. And so we see it there. Irenaeus does the same thing. he talks about how Matthew had first written to the Jewish people, but that he did it again in a Hebrew dialect. Pontianus went to India, and at the end of the 2nd century, when he had gotten to India, he believed that he was the first one to actually bring them the gospel. He turns out he was wrong. He found out that Bartholomew had made it there before he did. And when he got there, he found that they were reading a Hebrew dialect of Matthew's gospel. Origen says the same thing, that he composed it in Hebrew letters. Eusebius said the same thing. Jerome said the same thing. They're all saying that he had written something in Hebrew that was just this collected statements, or these logia, as Papias states. So to me, the earliest stage of this Hebrew Matthew demonstrates from the patristics and the fathers that they knew of a circulated text. In fact, Jerome claimed to have an actual copy of it from the library of Caesarea that was given to him, that Pamphilus the martyr had compiled and apparently did some textual critical work on, and he was able to translate that in Rome. But what's funny is by the time Jerome is doing his Latin Vulgate, the Hebrew version of Matthew is almost completely out of usage. Nobody really has it. I mean, he, with all of the wealth of knowledge and all the wealth of materials he had access to, he had to get a copy of it nowhere in his region down in Caesarea to even have a copy. So clearly it was no longer needed in circulation by the time Jerome is translating. But there seems to be this really no dispute, because everybody's like, well, Matthew first or Mark first. It's like, yeah, but every single church father that says Matthew is first is speaking of an earlier Matthew, some sort of Hebrew Aramaic Matthew, not a Greek Matthew. And then the text itself demonstrates to me, Matthew demonstrates that it has been translated, not from, that it has been translated and not that it is following a Greek sentencing. There's multiple places where it has syntactical changes that come from translation, not from transmission, multiple Aramaic and Hebrewisms that are not found in any of the 3 gospels. It's the only gospel that does not quote from the Septuagint. It's doing its own translation of the Hebrew text itself, except for I think 1 or 2 places total. So it seemed to be doing its own translation of Hebrew. If it were just following a Greek origin, why not just do what Luke did and John did and just quote the Septuagint? And there it doesn't. So my answer, I guess, to the Matthew part there's internal reasons to believe that, in addition to what all of the early patristics are saying about it as well.
I mean, but how do you account for the amount of text both Luke and Matthew share that it's part of Mark? And how do you differentiate between a Hebrew Matthew sayings of Jesus versus what scholars describe as source Q?
So Q is
which source Q has never been demonstrated to be like an actual source.
Right.
It's a hypothetical source. That's possibly an oral tradition. But what evidence is there of a Matthew written in Hebrew in the 1st century that you know of?
Well, all the reasons I just demonstrated, that they all, including Jerome had a copy of one. And that they're all apparently, and Origen would have been very interested in a Hebrew Matthew, because he, doing his hexaplats, would have been very familiar with setting up things side by side, both translation and transmission. He did it with the Old Testament. So him being interested in a Hebrew Matthew, because he had known Hebrew, would have been very important for him to note. So he clearly had some sort of record of the Hebrew Matthew himself. But they also state that it was translated later too. And this is something that I found, which I go back to. Mm-hmm. Matthew has indicators within of itself that it was not originally based in Greek. It started in another language and made it over. Just the preposition tate in Greek, following the same Aramaic pattern, and a lot of the Aramaic texts that we have of transitioning happens multiple times in Matthew's gospel, following the pattern of somebody who's recording something in Aramaic. But Luke in those same places is not, same places, Mark in those same places do not. Now, as far as what you mentioned about, it seems like Matthew and Luke are borrowing from Mark. I agree with that, because if Mark is based on Peter's eyewitness account sermons that he was preaching in Rome and Mark wrote them for him, then he's a star witness. And Luke would have needed all the star witness accounts he could get to compile the gospel he did, because he's not an eyewitness, and he said he wasn't. And Matthew, for example, Matthew is not at scenes that Peter was at. He was not there in the deep part of the garden with Jesus. He was not there on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. He was not at the tomb after Jesus was resurrected from the dead. He was not there for major discussions that Jesus had on the side with Peter, James, and John. Matthew would have been more of an observable eyewitness who is not constantly involved in the scenes of Jesus's life. He's more of an observer. And honestly, he would have been one of the most qualified of anybody to write down. He was a tax collector. And if Matthew truly is a tax collector, he would have known multiple languages. He would have been writing tax receipts. He would have known Hebrew, Aramaic, probably Greek and Latin, maybe even others. But he certainly would have known at least those four to be a tax collector. So he would have been the most qualified to script any of the sermons of Jesus. So when it comes to having a template, it appears that there's this connectivity for Luke and for Matthew with Mark, because Mark supplies the connection. And that makes sense, because if Matthew needs Mark and Luke needs Mark, you're going to find Mark built into it. But the thing is Matthew, being in a Greek text, had to be translated over. This would have been later. I personally think Matthew was translated after Luke was published. And I think that we have, and even the early church fathers talk about how Matthew is translated over. They talk about the possibility of both Barnabas and John and James and others that were in the city of Jerusalem, a part of the church of Jerusalem at the time, were actually translating it to Greek. And that makes perfect sense, because if the gospel is to make it outside of the parameters of the Jewish people, although that was the original intent, what good is that gospel to anybody in Ephesus or Rome or Pergamum or somewhere like that? It's no good to them, because those people don't know the Aramaic Hebrew language. The trade language at the time was Koine Greek. So what better idea to take the collection of Matthew's gospel, other eyewitnesses that survive in Jerusalem, and to utilize Peter's testimony and Mark and work out a gospel on behalf of the church of Jerusalem and send that gospel in Greek? That would be the most sensible thing to do. And I think that's why they did what they did. So Matthew's gospel would have started very small, almost like just a collection of Jesus's statements. And it would have been corroborated with Peter's testimony and Mark, in addition to any of the other eyewitnesses that were still in Jerusalem, working out a collective group gospel in Greek while translating sections over from what Matthew had originally collected in Hebrew or Aramaic. So I don't think that Matthew was before Mark. I think Matthew was using Mark 100%. But we do have not only indicators from the first century, being Papias, who was alive with John. He's stating that this is how Matthew came into existence. He collected sayings in Hebrew, and later translators put them into an interpretation that could be understood in their own languages.
I mean, I can see that. If we can maybe bring this down to just like a simple conversation, right? Like if we're talking about something that would constitute as an eyewitness testimony,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, surely just within this 5-minute conversation, you can realize just how complex seems to be the literary sources that are at play in these gospels. That what you would expect if what each one of these gospels is a person that was written by someone that was there as an eyewitness, seeing what happened, that this person or any person, if it was a true eyewitness, they shouldn't have to rely on some other tradition and having to collect things and sort of like make composites of Q sayings or a Hebrew Matthew and what Mark said. it should be someone's, you'd think that it'd be someone's testimony, like, this is what I saw, and this is what, my eyes, whatever. They list them.
You still there? I'm sorry, it cut out for a second. You still with me?
They're not that testimony. My screen went out for a...
You still with me?
Okay, good.
Okay, sorry, I just make sure you're still there.
Yeah, so I'm not so sure if this sort of is asking a question, but I mean, how do you account for all that? Like, what is your view on divine inspiration? Like, how did the Holy Spirit just work out this whole strategy to make all these different traditions fit, or how do you foresee that happening?
Yeah, well, kind of going back to that first point there, if it was simple, I'd be worried. If this was put together in a simplistic way, I would personally, as a Christian, if the Gospels were compiled under no problems, no issues, no run-ins, no cooperating, no independency in places, I would be overly concerned at the simplicity of the Gospels because nothing that happened was simple. These are people that were under strict persecution at times. Documents had to be done a certain way. That's why I think there's certain details that people are left anonymous in the synoptics, that John comes behind later and reveals names because by the time he's writing, they're dead and it wouldn't matter. He seemed to protect people. The Gospels were protecting people that were involved in the sceneries. If it were simple, I'd be concerned. The fact that Matthew needs Peter is a good thing because Matthew may have been there, but like I said, Matthew wasn't there for everything. Matthew is not there for the Mount of Transfiguration. He was not there when Jesus first called the disciples off of their fishing boats to come follow him. Just like Peter in Mark's gospel is insufficient by himself, because what John tells us later is that Jesus had a story before Peter showed up on the scene and long after Peter left the scene. And so John's able to start further back than Peter because he was actually not naming himself in the scene with Jesus, spent that evening with him after John the Baptist proclaimed him, and that he remained a disciple with Jesus long after Peter was killed. So they do need each other in that regard, because even though they may have all been on the scene, multiple perspective is necessary to give a better picture. And Matthew cannot produce a gospel by himself that would be sufficient to represent the fullness of the narrative without the aid of other people like Peter, or perhaps stories from James the Just in Jerusalem, who would have been a family member of Jesus, who can recount things that happened to Jesus's family when he was like the story of the wise men coming to Jesus when he was probably a toddler. Matthew would know that. Peter wouldn't know that. But if Matthew knew James, who grew up in the same house with Jesus, who was a bishop there in Jerusalem, the first bishop of the very first church that was ever started, then James can supply things to help Matthew's gospel, both in lineage, his story as a toddler with the wise men. Matthew can't produce that. Mark can't produce that. John can't produce that. Paul can't produce that. Luke can't produce that. But James the Just can. He grew up in that household. He knew Jesus from a child as being his half brother. So no doubt to me, I would be concerned if they didn't have correspondence amongst themselves to compile narratives to make a gospel, because then it would be, to me, suspect that they were just making this up off their own intuition or their own theories, or perhaps their own perception without being in check. As far as the divine inspiration side of things go, I don't think this is something they constructed later. I think Jesus instructed them that they were going to do this. For example, in John 14, Jesus said that he was leaving. He said, I'm leaving. He said, but I'm not leaving you comfortless. I'm sending the Paraclete. And so he says he's going to send the Spirit. Then he reveals himself to his disciples. And Philip, had asked the famous question, show us the Father. It would suffice us. And Jesus said, I've been with you this whole time, and you're asking to see the Father. He that has seen me has seen the Father. Then Judas, who is called Thaddeus in other Gospels, Judas, not Iscariot, states, are you going to reveal yourself to the world and to us, or just us? And Jesus gives them this long answer. He builds this long answer and tells them basically, the commandments that I give to you, those that obey them, I will come make my home with them, and so will the Father. The problem with that is Jesus didn't write a single word. We don't have any documents of Jesus. We don't have any writings of Jesus, just like we don't have any of Socrates or any of these great teachers of their time. Their disciples wrote what they taught and said. That's exactly what happened.
Exactly the tradition of prophets in the Hebrew Bible.
Say that again.
And you know, that wasn't exactly the tradition of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible.
Oh, sure,
it
was.
They wrote their own message, and to be suspect of no correspondence between the Gospels, because that might point towards a conspiracy or something. I would say not necessarily. And where do you get that criteria? Because that's not necessarily the criteria or a criteria to say validate the writings in the Hebrew Bible as well, where there's not necessarily a correspondence between churches or locales. I mean, why would that criteria be something that would be positive evidence of the reliability of the Gospels?
Well, I might need you to re-ask that second one. The first one, that's true of a lot of the prophets. Elijah and Elisha did not write any of their text. Even Jeremiah himself had Baruch write his text for him. So not all the prophets wrote their own texts. Many of them were orators. They were speakers. But in that count of John 14, he tells them that they, his disciples, were going to be the ones who recounted his statements, his commandments, his teachings to the world that Judas was asking about. He had already informed them that he was going to leave, but his message was being entrusted to them. And he states that the Spirit would bring back to remembrance, because he knew their human inefficiencies to remember and to recount. And the writers admit that. John, multiple times in the Gospel of John, says, we didn't understand this at that time. We didn't understand these things. He said these things, but at that point, we did not understand it. They were admitting to their inabilities to rehearse and understand events that they became clear about over time, which goes with what Jesus said would happen. I'm sending the Spirit to bring back to remembrance. So not all Jewish prophets did write. They did have other people have to write on their behalf. Now, your second question was about the churches. Can you ask the question about the churches?
So referring back to you said that I'd be suspect if there were no correspondence between the Gospels. And I said that that's not necessarily a criteria that one would require or expect to see from, say, the writings in the Old Testament.
Well, that's in regards to the New Testament, the events that were being published. Let's take John's gospel. I think it would require that, because John himself was writing with a group based on what we do know of John's gospel and its origin, both from the Muratorian fragment as well as from the Antimarcionate prologue and Clement of Alexandria. They all state that John was writing on behalf of multiple people that were a part of his group. I call it the Johannine community. So having the capacity to put together a better gospel because multiple people are there would be good, because Jesus was not just commissioning a single person. Like Jeremiah was commissioning Baruch. God said, have your scribe or your friend Baruch here write these things for you. Whereas Jesus didn't commission like a single individual. He didn't say, all right, Matthew, you're the most skilled with the pen, or anything like that. He told all of his eyewitnesses that were there in the scene, you're going to tell my commandments. You're going to rehash my story to the world. And I'm going to bring the Spirit to remembrance. So anybody that was there is qualified and authorized by Jesus himself to give a testament of what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And so that's why it was so important to even the Gnostic Christians to put a eyewitness name on their account, because to put a name of a non-eyewitness on your account gives you no credibility. And so when the eyewitnesses were there, and if they're producing a group gospel, which I think Matthew and John are group gospels, I think Mark is simplistic. And like I think you said that Mark is straight to the point. He is very much straight to the point, because he's merely writing down a straight to the point kind of speaker, and that's Peter. So he has no reason to move around. He's succinct, but he's also not chronological. He's also very sloppy. He doesn't know when to stop. There's a lot of transition problems in correlation. So Luke is more of a very studied, well-learned Greco writer, very much studied in the classic Greeks. And he's writing out a very succinct account that's separate from what Mark was able to do, because Mark was writing more as under dictation, whereas Luke's more of a free scribal write. And so for me, it's important that Luke actually gets multiple perspectives, because Luke wasn't there, and he said as much at the beginning. If he's not interviewing the eyewitnesses, he's no different than the many that tried to make an account that he talked about in verse 1 that failed to produce a accurate account of the life and ministry of Jesus. His would have just fallen to the wayside too, had he not had eyewitness testimony within his reports and approval from the eyewitness testimonies. And we can get to him in a minute, because you brought up a really good point about him. Then John's with a group. That's why you see in the beginning of John's gospel, we beheld. Who's this we keep, and then we know his testimony is true at the very end of the gospel. Why is he speaking in the plural? Because I think it's a group of people that are actually putting this gospel together, not just John himself. So I think Matthew was translated and published by Matthew himself from his account of what he had recollected as a scribe to Jesus's ministry, his sayings. He also brought in Mark, Peter's statements about Jesus. He used that as a template, integrated his own understanding and teachings of Jesus with Mark. That's where you get this Matthean perspective. And then you have this connectivity even to Luke in some ways, almost like Matthew is familiar with Luke. And I know there's people that just debate which one was after which one. I think Luke was actually before Matthew, and I think you can see some of that in Matthew. But then you also see information that comes in from the family of Jesus, bloodline, childhood. Where does that come from? Well, he was in Jerusalem with James. James, not James, the brother of John, James, the brother of Jesus, who grew up with Jesus. So he's going to implement James's story there. We see multiple facets of Matthew where it's not just an independent work, a guy working by himself. It is a group of eyewitnesses publishing it. All of them are group testimonies, gospels, in my opinion, except for Mark, which is why it's the most direct.
So, I mean, I think I agree with most of that. Certainly, there does seem to be a lot of interplay between the gospels. I see other things that I think they're a little different. I see things a little differently. I see Matthew sometimes. Well, first of all, Mark is not always succinct. Mark sometimes rambles on, and some of his narratives are providing more information than other gospels do provide.
Sure.
And where you might theorize that perhaps Matthew is cutting stuff off. You know, he's leaving some details out, it seems like. And at times he even disagrees with his counterparts. You know, he disagrees with Luke on passages that are, like, to me, very, very significant. Like, for example, the birth accounts and what goes on, you know, during that first year of Jesus. You know, where do Joseph and Mary start out? You know, Matthew seems to have them start out in Bethlehem already. And Luke, they're not in Bethlehem, they're in Nazareth, but they were required to travel to Bethlehem for a census. Mm-hmm. The birth news was given to Joseph in one, to Mary in another. And that doesn't mean that both things couldn't have happened, but you do have to wonder why they're so different, why the journeys that they take. You know, one goes to Egypt, the other one doesn't necessarily go to Egypt. So what's going on in there? And so I do see more of like competing accounts rather than a correspondence of let's make sure that we get our facts straight, or let's make sure we communicate what the Lord wants us to communicate. I'm not so sure that I see that correspondence of scripture happening in the Gospels, and for the same reasons that you believe them to be, perhaps.
Well, let me ask you this. When it comes to, say, Matthew and Luke on the childhood, which aspect of you're saying that one came from, one indicates being Matthew, he was already in Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm. They start out in Bethlehem already.
Traveling to Bethlehem. So are you taking the scenery there, I guess, when Jesus was met by the wise men versus his birth narrative coming into the scene where, there's the shepherds that come, and I guess, would you say that that's all in the same time, I guess? And that's why they seem to be different.
I think just based on just a plain reading of each of the narratives, you ask yourself, where are they living? Where does Matthew have them living? Because he doesn't mention anything about the census. Mm-hmm. He just has them start out in Bethlehem. And, he's born, and then they go to Egypt because of the fear of the killing of the babies. Whereas Luke starts out where there are actually Nazareth, and he talks about the census of that Joseph needs to enlist, which, by the way, it seems ridiculous to me. Or, I mean, that's maybe a little harsh, but it seems sort of inadequate to ask people to travel to their homeland or hometown, and in the case of Joseph, to a place where it would have, years ago. Like, why would you have them go back to somewhere? Like, if I would ask that for a census to travel to Colombia and enlist there for an American census, that it doesn't work. And it just seems rather suspect. It seems like an excuse. The birth location, it takes place. There's no mention or anything that hints of a stable. Now, you could argue the visitors come at different times, and that's why. But why wouldn't Luke mention the Magi? That seemed rather significant. But he doesn't.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And
it's things like that,
Yeah. Yeah, and they definitely, I think there are a couple years difference. Luke's focusing, Matthew just makes a pinpointed, he went to Bethlehem, he was born in this way. During Herod the king, wise men came to Jerusalem because it says Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's it. That's all it says. But between verse 1 and when the Magi actually get there, when they see the star, it would have been probably a year to 2 years before the wise men actually made the trip from the East Persian area and made it over to Jerusalem. So this is so I get in trouble with Christians every Christmas on this point. I always say, you have your wise men at the stable scene, but you actually should probably put them somewhere on the other side of your house, because we always in Christendom have put the shepherds and the wise men all at the manger scene. And there's actually no evidence to demonstrate the wise men were at the manger scene. There's two reasons. One, the shepherds were told you'll find the babe wrapped in these swaddling clothes in Luke's gospel, whereas it talks about the star that these wise men saw was over the child. So the child there, that's a different word. It's a different Greek word than babe. The child there indicates more of a toddler age, whereas the babe is obviously infancy. So clearly the time between the Luke demonstration of the shepherds coming to the stable was long after, maybe a year to 2 years after, when the wise men show up. So I think they're reporting two different times. And another indication is obviously that the shepherds were told that he would be found in a stable lying in a manger, whereas the wise men came to a house in Matthew's gospel. So not only is it a different scene, it's a different time, it's a different location. The child is listed as a different age, just in the Greek wording of his identity as being a babe versus a child. And the realistic expectation that these wise men seen this star, they were kingmakers. Why would Matthew focus on the wise men and Luke not? And then Matthew focuses on the Egypt trip. Luke does not. Well, because Matthew's making a point, and you made this in your opening, and I thought it was a well-observed point on your part. You stated that the differences of philosophy as well as the different audiences. Well, if Matthew's trying to point to the fact that Jesus is the king of the Jews, you killed your king. And he did it through the Davidic numbering, even the way he did his genealogies. I mean, he skipped people and cut people out of the genealogy just to have 3 sets of 14, starting with David's name at the top to give you the Davidic number of 14. He's already demonstrating this child is a descendant of David. And his parents are citizens registered back through the city of David, the town of David. He's making Jesus the Davidic king in his demonstration. And so he's also doing a 2 nuance section there. He's pointing him to David and to Moses. And multiple places in Matthew's gospel, you see these parallels between Jesus and Moses. After all, the Messiah was told by Deuteronomy 18, Moses said, a prophet will come like unto me. So there's going to be similarities. The killing of babies, which is what happens there in Matthew's account. Moses went to Egypt and was called out of Egypt. Jesus, Egypt, called out of Egypt. There's connectivity to the Mosaic connection. Moses received the law on a mountain. Jesus delivered that law on the mountain. There's multiple places in Matthew that parallel with Moses, where Jesus parallels with Moses. So Matthew's focusing on that perspective. Luke is, in my opinion, a physician. He's more interested in why this child, how this child could have been virgin born, the livelihood of his family, which Luke met with James based on the Acts accounts of Paul's ministry. If he's with Paul during that second, third missionary journey, he would have met up with James for a large amount of times. He would have also received information from James. He would have been more interested in that dynamic than Matthew and vice versa. So again, this is where they're unique to themselves because they do have different audiences and they are focusing on different elements. Matthew is pointing to Jesus as King of the Jews. Luke is pointing to him as a servant of men, and he's going to collect the data that fits to what his audience needs to learn and know about Jesus, whereas Matthew is going to do the same thing over here. I don't think it's an issue of rival as much as uniqueness that's needed, because Jesus was a multifaceted teacher. Most of what he said, I mean, you could probably relate with this as much as I can. You go to a public speaking, it doesn't have to be a sermon or by a preacher. It could just be any great figure gets up and speaks. This person in this part of the audience may have taken away one major point and dynamic of what was said. And that same point went over somebody else's head and it was of no value, no application to their own. And they take that material and they take something else that was said. And you can walk away with 2 different people listening to the same sermon or same presentation and have 2 totally different talking points from it, but it's still the same talking individual or the same sermon or the same series or the same presentation, but the application from one guy to the next may be massively different and how they want to convey that back to people they're going to share it with. And so that's, I think, what we see there in the Matthew and Luke accounts personally. I don't know your thoughts on that, but I do think there's a couple year gap between what's going on in Matthew and Luke.
Oh, I'm not so sure what the gap is between Matthew and Luke. Isn't it like maybe 10 years?
No, I mean about the narrative of Jesus being born, the wise men showing up at the toddler age of Jesus, the recording of the full journey. Matthew's just kind of not even dealing with that. He's just going straight to kingmakers came to Jesus, because that would have been Jesus is King of the Jews, and it was established from his birth into his childhood that he was even anointed by kingmakers as a king, or recognized by pagans as a king.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what I think is that perhaps, they do have some historical kernels that they share that you can be like, all right, they're at least describing the same event in history. But the very fact that that each writer resorts to certain what I would define as literary tools, namely the portraying of Jesus or the comparing of Jesus, unlike to perhaps other mythological heroes of the Greco-Roman world at the time, that each author sort of like has his own sort of take on it. Like if the audience is going to be primarily a Jewish audience, which might be indeed the case for Matthew, then I'm going to make sure that I allude to concepts that would appeal to Jewish people, or at least people that have like a messianic expectation, which many of them did, if not most Jews during the first century were kind of apocalyptic. And so therefore he catered the message, and consequently each consequent gospel writer did the same. But I don't really see that as evidence of, that it's just a natural thing to occur among humans when brought in for a witness deposition or something. What I do see is people deliberately making their best shot at portraying Jesus as the God to follow, as the ideology to believe. And in the liberty that they take in portraying Jesus in his unique ways, is evidence to me that they were not necessarily writing from the influence of a divine spirit that was guiding anything. Rather, these are highly, maybe not all of them. I think that if you get into like the analyzing the Greek of Mark, scholars have argued that perhaps it's not all that sophisticated, and so they're not all the same at the same level academically, but they gave it their best shot, and people didn't quite know what to do with how to harmonize some of these things, and just kept on including them as part of their tradition, but not necessarily that they were eyewitness accounts, in that what everything that they say was absolutely true because they saw it through their eyes. But perhaps it did include some accounts from people that did see some things. But my qualm is my issue. I take issue is with like the extraordinary things that occur in the Gospels. Those are the things that to me, like, was really a resurrected Jesus walking around, that sort of thing.
Well, kind of going into, and I think it's important to note that I think Dr. Ehrman says this all the time, that the Gospels were independent, for independent witnesses. They are, but they aren't, if I can put it that way. They're independent in that each of them has their own independent perspective and leaning. They're not in the fact that three of them, two of which I believe are heavily relied upon one of them. So they're not completely independent. Like Matthew's not completely independent. Luke's not completely independent. They're dependent on Mark, but they do have their independency. Obviously, there's Luke and material that is not in Matthew and Mark. And then there's Matthean material that's not in Luke and Mark. So, and then John, I mean, that one's not even really up for discussion, but they do have their uniqueness. Yeah. Oh yeah. Very different. They do have their uniqueness to the equation, which shows the personality of the writer. See, I think the fact that Mark had to have Mark had to actually have Peter tell him approval and write for him tells me a lot about Peter. One, if it is Peter, he's not a writer. Two, why is he not a writer? Well, probably because he's barely trained at all in any written text. We know that Peter had to use an amanuensis in 1 Peter. He used Silvanus as his writer to write his own epistle. Again, we see where Paul writes on his own accord, and then he uses them anyway. He uses both. Peter doesn't seem that way. Seems like he's constantly having to use somebody to write for him. He's a speaker. And, when you get to John, for example, I want to kind of hone in on him. You made a comment that you said that, let's see, he's philosophical in style. So the styles are inconsistent. Again, if they were all consistent, then they would probably be the same group writing the same four gospels. And if they're the same group writing the four gospels, then again, I have much to be concerned about, because that looks like there's some they're conspiring to produce a narrative for themselves and control that narrative. If they're independent in the sense of their authorship, if Peter authorized Mark, if Paul authorized Luke, if John was a part of a group that authorized that one, and Matthew was not just himself, but also the others that were in Jerusalem, and they sent it out as a Jerusalem gospel to the Gentile churches, then they are independent in the nature of their origin. They're by the same people that were with Jesus, but they're at different people that were with him, like Peter, Paul, etc. So when you get to the philosophical side of John, like you're saying that you have concerns about it being philosophical.
Well, like,
why would that be?
There's a clear Platonic influence on the text, like just from the get-go, the way that John paints Christ as the logos. I mean, that's a whole other theology that's at play there. Like, and I would venture to say that each gospel, like if we were to come up with a Christology from each gospel, they're going to be quite different. And so I could understand if all gospels are divinely inspired, that, okay, I will allow some personality differences in some things. But in terms of its theology, that I'm not so sure, because then what's going on there with the Holy Spirit?
Well, just based on the usage of the Logos, I wouldn't say that he is teaching a different theology there. For example, that goes back to, where is John? John is reported as writing his gospel, or narrating his gospel. He is not ever said as being the writer, but the narrator. If he is writing or narrating a gospel there in Ephesus is the headquarters of philosophical thinking, and some of the best thinkers and scribes in the world are in the city that he is starting churches that Paul had already established. And so for me, if John is trying to make an argument about Jesus as the Logos, because the Logos was understood as this invisible power or force that created, and if John is actually teaching philosophical people in the most philosophical city in the Roman Empire, this is the Logos that you've been looking for this whole time. That's not unique to a strategy of John. He may have gotten that from Paul. I mean, Paul himself even went to Athens and looks over at all these different inscriptions to these different gods of the world, and he comes up to this inscription of the unknown God. And he says, let me tell you about the unknown God. And then what does he do? He preaches a whole sermon and applies that unknown God to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, revealed himself through the person of Jesus Christ. He took a ideology, a theology of the pagans, this polytheism, and they were so polytheistic and wanted to make sure they didn't lack any worship to any of the gods, that if they missed one, we need to put out an inscription to that unknown that's still out there. And so Paul took their mindset of thinking and introduced to them to a God they had never recognized in their sculptures. And he preached unto them the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, revealed through the person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Right, I don't see that as any different than what John is doing in his gospel.
Well, that's the Hellenistic Platonic influence that I'm referring to. Because if you question that perspective, namely, would that be something that would come from Judaism? Like, is that what the Hebrew Bible teaches?
Well, Jesus told him to go.
Because it seems pretty clear that the God of the Jews, which gets rebranded as the Father in Christianity, is a named God, and that's pretty clear. I mean, it may be lost in translation because when you read the Old Testament, it reads Lord, uppercase, all uppercase, or uppercase L, if it's Elohim. But clearly, there's a name for this God, and he has revealed himself according to the Jewish faith. So, if anything, that sort of approach demonstrates a Hellenic Platonic influence of, the possibility of a God that's not just this one being, but rather some immaterial God, and that's what's in play here.
I don't know if they're influenced by that as much as they're trying to influence a culture that is influenced by that. To me, this is a strategic move. I mean, if Jesus said to go into all nations and make disciples, you cannot expect to make all of those Gentiles or people with the different backgrounds Judaized perspectives. And that wasn't what Jesus was trying to do anyway. He was actually bringing cultural divides even amongst his own people. That's why the Jews couldn't stand him. I mean, he was sitting there eating with people of moral corrupted values, and then he was sitting there having conversations with Samaritans. I mean, that's why they had an issue with Jesus, is because he was breaking cultural barriers and actually demonstrating that each cultural perspective had elements of truth, and those same truths could point back to the same God. And that's what he did. He broke the cultural barrier in John 4 with the woman at the well. Well, our Samaritan Pentateuch says that the place of worship is here, whereas your Jewish Pentateuch translations say that it's in Jerusalem. Jesus pretty much eliminated and said the fact that God should be worshipped by his people was never meant to be in a place, but in a person, and pointed to himself. He broke the barrier about perspectives. And so what I think that Paul was doing in his ministry to Gentiles, and then John had to learn this himself going to Gentiles in Ephesus, is you're not going to Judaize Greeks. In fact, they even agreed in their Jewish council not to do that, not to force the Greeks and the Gentiles under circumcision, not to force them into eating the same dietary laws that they did. They agreed not to do that to the Greeks. They agreed to let them be Greeks and let them be Gentiles. For me, if the Greeks had always believed in this idea of this invisible power, this force that created all things and sustains them, but that there is no connectivity between creator and creation, for John to make that an argumentative point to say, you guys were right. Your philosophy, your Stoic or your Hellenistic philosophy, pointing to this one creator who created and sustained this invisible power. Let me tell you who he really is. See, to me, that's meeting people where they are. That's meeting them to where they understand creation, sustainability, universe. But you're not changing your message by saying, but it's not, they didn't turn it around and say, oh, but you were right. It was Apollos. Or it was one of the Titans or something like that. They didn't agree with their theology of it. They're actually pulling them away and saying your view of God or gods was partially right. There is a Logos. But let me tell you who the real Logos is and who he was and what he did. And so what John did was brilliant, in my opinion, by taking the most philosophical people in the world, wrote a gospel that they could correlate and understand, pointed them to Jesus as being the Logos that they were seeking and trying to understand all these years, that they should stop searching for this mysterious force and realize that that power that created actually became a man. And so if John believed that was true, it would make sense that he would start from their perspective, their understanding, and bring it to a person, because that's what Jesus does through the rest of John's gospel, is he stops pointing it at locations, names like, oh, worship here, worship there. No. Worship of God was always meant to be in a person, not a place or a perspective. And it seems like John follows that same trend that Jesus was doing in John 4. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you could sort of like paint it that way. I just feel like it just seems rather convenient that the times in which the New Testament authors wrote these Gospels were times where those ideas were already in circulation. Like, the belief on resurrected gods was already a thing. the belief on the need for a savior or some divine figure to take you to the other side, if you will, after you die. I think that the Egyptians for thousands of years were already preaching a very similar message of resurrection and the need for some divine grace on a final judgment. And so it's really, to me, no surprise why the New Testament authors would reflect a lot of those commonly accepted views of the time. But it just doesn't do it for me in terms of, oh, these messages were indeed inspired by God. You see, and therefore must all be true. They could have been wrong in many instances, including their claim on that Jesus resurrected. And if that goes away, then you really, like Paul said, you have no Christianity.
Well, of course. But would you not expect eyewitnesses, if they actually saw, touched, and felt the resurrected Jesus, to report? I mean, that's what they're claiming to do. They're claiming to report what they've seen. They spent 40 days with him after his resurrection, had meals with him, touched him. I mean, that would make sense of why Christianity boomed immediately after this event. Like, these people were willing to die for it. I mean, they all did, save maybe John. He was tortured. Like, to me, if they're going to make this up, fake this resurrection story, where, for example, like, you have these resurrection narratives with Romulus and others that were before Jesus. They couldn't even agree whether that's what happened. I mean, even some, like Dionysius, for example, reporting of Romulus, he's like, some say he was resurrected, and not resurrected from the dead because he never died. It was more of he was just caught up. He never actually died first. But he said the more plausible explanations is that the senators chopped his body into pieces, stuck him under their robes, and ran out and buried him secretly. Like, there was conflict between what happened to Romulus, trying to deify him, whereas the disciples, they all came out with the same narrative of Jesus is resurrected. We were with him. We touched him. And Paul was willing to imprison and kill people for even making mention of this. He completely switches his view of this after having his own experience with Jesus. And all of these people died for it. Not many people would die for a lie like that, like where you're able to convince millions of people across the Roman Empire to put their faith and die with the apostles, not just the eyewitnesses, the people that died in Colosseums, the people that died in these circuses that were put on by Nero, burned alive, crucified. Why would somebody, if they didn't under conviction believe what they actually saw and experienced was true, die for something that's that conspiratorial and a lie? To me, they were completely convinced of what they saw. They reported it, they taught it, they shared it, they moved that message as far as they could and came to accept it. To me, there's a lot of reasons to accept the belief of the narrative, not just from the standpoint of these texts say so. There's historical reason to do it in addition to that. And then there's even, to me, a logical side of that. Like, these men died for it. Why would they die for something like that? But that's just, again, these are my perspectives. And I realize that when it comes to this matter, we've made it that simple in Christianity. And I want to sympathize with your perspective for a minute. We've simplified things that are not simple. And it doesn't mean they're not true, but, and I appreciate, and I know that, I'm not sure your intent of the statement earlier on in the discussion. You said that, to me, that's complex or something along those lines, like that's complex way of the gospel. I'm actually thankful you said that, because I don't want a simplistic view. If this is so simple, I'm skeptical. Like, I'm skeptical of the simple, because I don't see the issue of miracles being simple. I don't see the issue of the resurrection being simple. I don't think of the compilation being simple. These are complex situations.
I mean, what I mean is like it's complex in the sense that what we have to analyze, what we have to inspect as evidence is very complicated. How is it complicated? Well, you do have indeed four different, at least, well, you actually have more than four different accounts. It's just that we're not really getting into like the pseudepigraphy or the non-canonical there. Like if we consider those, that you've got 10, 15 competing but you got at least four where they do seem to agree on a lot, but it also shows an interdependency on perhaps a Mark by at least 40%. So it doesn't seem like this would be this was a very organic, deposition type of. All right, so what did you see? Let's say you saw this, and that, right? These were very sophisticated accounts that are doing a lot, and that's why I'm referring to it as perhaps you're right. Perhaps some of them had a team of authors. But see, you see that as positive. I see that as suspicious. I mean, did the Holy Spirit need that going on? I'm not so sure. And then when you talk about like the the apostles willing to die for their message, like where do you get that if not from the scriptures themselves? Which I see that now as more of a circular reasoning. We need like evidence outside of the New Testament so that you can grant those points, because it's just, how do you know that Peter or Paul died for his faith outside of the New Testament?
Well, history says so.
Or much later in the church. I mean, I'm talking contemporary evidence, like from contemporary historians.
Well, Clement knew Peter and Paul and mentioned both their martyrdoms in First Clement. He's a first century document. I mean, he mentions both their martyrdoms and he knew them both. So, I mean,
but even still, like, there are peoples of other religions that have been willing and have died for their faith. That in and of itself does not necessarily make their testimonials true. We have to look at other things, and that's where I see that some of those extraordinary claims on the New Testament, one of them being, and most importantly, the resurrection, that demands, in order for me to accept that claim, we're going to have more evidence than just, well, there are manuscripts from a long time ago that say that this went on.
Well, to me, it's more than just manuscripts. A manuscript means nothing. Even an old manuscript means nothing. Where that manuscript came from is what's most important. Kind of going back to what you said there on the, and I know our time's running out here. By the way, I appreciate the conversation. It's been good.
Yeah, thank you.
Going back to, for example, I'm trying to figure out how to state this with the Gospels themselves. When I say they're complex, I don't mean that you have to try to like pull from here to make it happen. What I mean by that is it's not as simple as one guy sat down one time and wrote a bunch of stuff down and then just handed it out, and the churches just, took it in and said, great, this is wonderful. I have a different view of inspiration than maybe some Christians do. I don't believe that the disciples or the prophets in the past were sitting under some sort of spiritual trance and they're just kind of like writing something that they don't like in a trance. They don't know what they're doing. They're just unconscious agents that God is using. Like, I don't have that view. My view is that God used the personality and the memory. Like when you see in Peter, anytime you see Peter in Mark's gospel, he's the main character. He's the one that when Jesus is talking to the disciples, somehow Peter's the only one addressed. When the disciples are talking to Jesus, somehow Peter's the only one talking. When things are going on and people have to remember stuff, Peter remembers. Well, how does the writer know that? Peter thought to himself. The intentionality, the thoughts, the remembrance of the Gospel of Mark is always back to Peter. He's the one being talked to. He's the one talking on behalf of. The whole narrative is shifted and changed on him, getting it right or getting it wrong. Like when you look at these people in the process of like the Gospel of Mark, I see God using Peter in his memory, his consciousness, his frailty, his mistakes, and his getting it right to compile a gospel that would be, if you would, inspired by God. I think that Christians, and I know there's probably people listening to this program that are Christians that think that God was just like inspiration was some mystical, put them in a trance, write things they don't realize they're writing kind of thing. I actually don't hold that view of inspiration. I think God used the very uniqueness and even the limitations of humans to write his message. And I think Peter was very, very limited. And that is why if all we had was Peter's perspective, we'd have a very narrow view of the Gospels. John had a totally different perspective. John's like he's more of the quiet guy in the room that doesn't say much, but he thinks a lot. Peter doesn't think at all, and he just talks. And you see the differences there with Peter's Gospel, Mark, and John's Gospel. John is doing a lot of explaining of meaning and significance. Peter's just reporting. Now, he may give details because his audience needs it. I think one example that I use often is the ceremonially of washing. Matthew doesn't tell his audience why the Jews washed their cups a certain way, washed their hands a certain way. Mark does. Well, Mark's writing to people in Rome. They don't understand Jewish customs. So naturally, that section's longer than it is in Mark. But as a whole, Mark is shorter. But you see you see those personalities, the John's personality come out in the Gospel of John, and Peter's personality come out. So to me, God used the personalities of the people. I don't see that as like uniformity. If they're uniformity, I'm concerned because they're probably all the same author. I want them. I'm glad they're different. I'm glad they have different perspective and different personality in them. I think it's a good thing. Now, when it comes to the church, let me ask you this. Do you see in history anywhere where anybody else other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attributed to these four texts outside of those four names?
No, I don't think so. And it's been a tradition that's been going on for a long time in the church. I did want to ask you though, in your view of divine inspiration, at least with regards to the Gospels, are you open to the possibility of them being wrong in any way?
Yeah, I think that I get asked that a lot because I have Christian friends that actually think that they're capable. I haven't heard anything that would, I'm not a closed-minded person, but when we start getting into the synoptic issues, for example, some of the things that I hear people say are wrong or corrective. I think that we skip so many steps to get to that point. I am an inerrantist at this point in my life. I believe in inerrancy. I don't think my Christian faith would be shattered if I held a view like some of my Christian friends who are not inerrantists. But when it comes to like the synoptic problems, one of the things that I wrote down a long time ago, and I use it quite frequently is, and I actually have it written down somewhere right here. All contradictions contain differences, but not all differences contain contradictions. And I wrote that down a long time ago because what I think we've done in a lot of the synoptic problems is we've called things contradictions that are actually just different. And every contradiction will contain a difference. But just because something is different doesn't mean it's contradicting something else. There are differences.
Sure. I mean, it sounds very powerful, sounds very, contradiction. But I mean, even if they're not like clear contradictions, because I think maybe what you're referring to is like a formal contradiction, like to affirm something and deny it at the same time, right?
Sure. That would be.
But you do have sort of, I do see differing accounts or potentially problematic differences. Yes. Where the view of inspiration becomes challenging to me.
Yeah, one of the big ones,
And
like
you have other things like what? Uh-huh.
no, go ahead. So sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say like the ending of Mark. Why would Mark not add resurrection accounts?
What do you mean, post-resurrection accounts?
Yeah, yeah. You're right. Appearance. Oh,
Right. Yeah. Well,
why wouldn't he do that if that
yeah,
indeed happened?
yeah. So
And Mark
that's
was written first.
yeah, uh, because see, that's why it's important to me to know the origin of Mark's gospel. What was happening in Mark's gospel? He's recording something that Peter is saying. He's preaching. He's hearing these sermons all the time, and he's just recording. And there's so many places in Mark's gospel where it is clear that he is transmitting something verbal and making it written, which is why there's so many improper places in Mark or run-on sentences in Mark, because it's clear he's taking somebody's teaching, public teaching, and actually making it a written account. So for me, when I look at Mark, what was most important to Peter when he was alive was not something on paper. We see that from Papias. Even when Papias was talking about the life and ministry of Jesus, he said, I would rather have the living and abiding voices than a written account. I want the living, I'd rather hear it from the horse's mouth than to read about it in a text. That now some people take that to mean like, oh, well, that's belittling the gospels. No, that's not what he was saying. His point was, I want to hear it straight orally, because our culture is different. Most people were illiterate at that time, so oral speaking was the standard. Written was a secondary effect. A written text was only left behind out of compulsion, most times, more so than out of desire. It's clear Peter didn't want to write. He probably couldn't. It's clear John didn't write. He probably couldn't, or very little, or very elementary at best. That is why they had to have other people do this work for them. And to me, that demonstrates, like with Mark and with Peter, that their goal was to reach the people through oral tradition. But because oral tradition cannot be transmitted properly after the person is dead, you have to put it in writing. Mark, to me, was not writing a complete gospel. He was collecting anything that he could get from Peter's sermons and putting it into the best that he could succinct, at best, his succinct view of the gospel of Jesus. He mentions the fact that, so Mark's gospel, if you believe it ends in verse 8, is kind of open-ended. Like, Jesus is risen, women run in fear, that's it. And then you go, well, what a way to end something. What a way to leave a gospel open-ended, but it leaves it on a cliffhanger. Like, he's gone, he's risen. What are you going to do with him? And I mean, Jonah ends on a cliffhanger. Like, should I not spare these people and all these children and all these animals? And like, that's it. That's where the book ends. It's a question that never gets answered, because we, the audience, are meant to take that and say, what are we going to do with this? To me, Peter had preached an entire ministry of Jesus that Mark had recorded, and it was open-ended for his audience. This is what he said, this is what he did, this is what he proclaimed, this is what happened to him, and now he has risen from the dead. What are you going to do? And to me, that makes sense. If Mark's gospel is a sermon gospel, to be a cliffhanger for the audience to respond to everything that was said in it. So I don't see that as problematic, with the understanding of why was the Gospel of Mark written the way it was written.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how some of those nuances, like, I'm not arguing that Mark was left undone, or that it was something missing, but I do have to wonder, how do you go from Mark being written first around 70 AD to then Matthew coming out 10 years later with post-resurrection accounts and full-on dialogues and whatnot, 10 years later? And like, why would how would Matthew somehow end up having that, and then Mark thought that, it was not necessarily a good idea to include those narratives or whatnot. Why would Mark omit to include something that would then become a highly significant piece of evidence for audience to hear and therefore believe?
Well, I date the Gospels early. The only Gospel I date late is John. John, I date between 80 and 90, more closer to 90. I actually think that Mark was in the early 50s. But that's another discussion. Well, let's just say it's 70.
Yeah. It's not necessarily the majority view, right?
Well, it was the majority view for the last 2,000 years. It's not been the majority view in the last 80. I mean, the consensus is an ever-changing field. That was always the consensus up until about 80 to 100 years ago. But consensus isn't really... There are others that have different view of that too. I mean, that's been a debate for the last 100 years. There's academics that land differently on both sides, but it seems like the more popular view, yes, is that it is around 70. But that's not like a long time view. That's a more modern current view. That's not something that's been held by anybody at any point up until recent. But again, there's a lot of reasons for why some land here and some land there. But either way, let's just say it's 70. The fact that goes back to what I was saying about what was the standard for the churches. The standard is that they wanted the messages were delivered by oral teaching of the apostles themselves. This was significant. This was a bigger deal. We see this even in 2nd and 3rd John. Many things have I to write to you, but I would not do it with pen and ink or pen and paper, but face to face. The standard, the priority for the apostles was to first deliver it to the people, because there's less problems when you can do it in a human to human way. If you can get in front of 100 people and say it to them, that is easier. That is a lot easier than writing to a group. The writing is a necessitated evil that the disciples had to use, because writings can get plagiarized, writings can get changed and corrupted. That is why it was the secondary form of the church, not the primary form. But because of distance and travel and cannot be at everywhere at one time, like you and I are doing right now, you're in Texas, I'm in South Carolina, we're having a discussion. They couldn't do this. The priority to get to a church at a distance was to send them a letter to get by until they could repeat themselves to them in person, which is what 2nd and 3rd John were saying. I've got a lot I want to say, but I'm not going to do it in this document. I'm giving you what you need to know until I come to you. The goal of Matthew, the actual apostle, not the gospel, Matthew the apostle, or Peter, or John, or James, was not to give people written accounts. Their goal was to actually share the accounts. The churches weren't learning new things in these accounts. What they were given was connectivity to the apostles and something to outlive their life. They're not teaching them new material when they're sending them these accounts. Like, oh, wow, I didn't realize Jesus. In fact, John's assuming in a lot of places that the audience already knows the stories. He gives indicators of things like in John 11 with Mary. He's like, this is the same Mary that washed Jesus' feet with her tears. But he doesn't even tell you the story about that until chapter 12. He's already assuming they know that because they had been taught that. They'd learned that all of these years. He's not teaching them a new thing. He's writing them a secured testimony that was authenticated from them, because the disciples are dying off, and their legend of what they experienced and saw and heard will die with their body. And so the writing was out of compulsion. And that's exactly what Clement of Alexandria said happened with John. It's like out of necessity, he had to write this gospel. And the elders of Ephesus were like, man, you're getting old. You're going to die. We need you to get this down. So the same thing happened with Peter. Peter, you're constantly in life or death situations. You're going to have to get somebody to put this down for you. And that's what Mark did. So to me, the gospel accounts are not enough, really, in the sense of like what we really want in the gospels. Even the ending of John says many, many, many things could have been written that are not. Well, why didn't you write them? Like, why didn't you write them? If there were many things that libraries couldn't contain, why didn't you put them in this text? Because that wasn't the purpose of the text. The purpose of the text was to give the churches a sufficient, evidential, experiential text that they could cling to from the apostle themselves and hold to and transmit down to the ages long after they're dead. It wasn't there to tell all the stories they had told before. So the apostles were preaching many, many stories and extended editions of those stories that did not make it into the written tradition. I wish they did, but they didn't make it into the written tradition.
Well, I mean, but like we're sitting here speculating of those traditions, right? But there's not really what evidence do you have of those oral traditions?
Papias wrote 5 volumes on them that Irenaeus and Eusebius all corresponded with, and we have fragmented quotations from them from both Irenaeus and Eusebius, which he had learned from John the Elder and Aristion, who he claimed were the eyewitnesses of Jesus. And that's the living and abiding voices he was referring to. He had 5 entire volumes that were in addition to what we have in the Gospels. And so it's more of, again, like that second, third John, I've written these things because you need them, but I want to tell you more in person. The Gospels are sufficient to give us what we need to know about Jesus, but it's not everything about him.
I think those traditions come much later. You said Papias. When was that? 2nd century?
He wrote in the 2nd century, but he was alive from 60 to 130, I believe. But he was a hearer of John. He knew John the Apostle. He didn't know Jesus.
I mean, like, yeah, I mean, I can concede that there's enough tradition out there to not conclude that, you know, the New Testament didn't just appear out of nowhere. But I think what really needs to get to the bottom of this question of the reliability of the Gospels is it's really more so about the claims themselves rather than, you know, is there a precedence or is there a history behind, you know, these writings coming out? Can we trust a process, right? We can trust that there was a process where writings were scrutinized and sources were checked, but ultimately what matters here is, are claims that the New Testament Gospels make, are those claims reliable, and can we trust them today?
Well, sure. I think we can, because if they were based on people that were there and they're all saying the same thing, I think that makes, for any historical record, the foundational ground to build now a definitive historical argument of whether or not something happened or did not happen. It starts with the text, because we weren't there and we don't have eyewitnesses that are still alive to tell us. So what we have to go off of is those texts. And that's true. That's not just true of Christianity. That's true of Josephus and what he said in the Jewish Wars, Petonius, whoever we want to put in as historians or records. We have to start with the text, because that's all that's been left behind for us. Same thing with like the Roman histories about Romulus that I mentioned earlier. You have multiple historians that are trying to write the reports of what happened to Romulus in his life and at his death or disappearance, depending on the story. They were working together to put all their sources together to come up with a report. And the fact that those reports are so conflicting about what happened to the body of Romulus, whereas the Gospels are unanimously in agreement as to what happened to the body of Jesus, crucified, buried, rose again. There is a easier, groundbreaking work to be done when the Gospels are all, I'm just using the resurrection. I know there's other miracles, but the resurrection itself, if they're all saying the same thing, and one's coming from this guy's view and this guy's view and this guy's view, and then you have additional contemporaries that are coming in reporting the similar and same things, to me, there is like Paul, for example. Paul comes into the equation, and then you got to deal with his life change as a result of his experience. So now he's in agreement with these accounts. Died, buried, rose again. So now there's a continual argument to be built from the accounts to Paul to now the secondary sources that come off of these people that knew Paul, people that knew John, people that knew Peter. What are they saying? What did they hear from these people? And to me, that's the best way to do history. And if they are reports that are truly eyewitness based, that's how we take into account of anything, including in our modern, if we're in a court setting, people have been imprisoned and given death sentences off eyewitness reports.
Yeah, but you got to understand that you have to make a distinction in that it's not the same thing as to claim that something occurred because, you saw it or whatever. And that thing which you're claiming that occurred is something actually possible. As of now, I am not aware of any evidence that can show that a person can come back from the dead if they were really dead. And then you have things that you do have to question. Like, for example, when the Gospels say that Jesus' body ascended to heaven, what exactly happened there? Did his body levitate to a certain point in the atmosphere and then disappear? Or was this perhaps one of those many things, many claims in the New Testament that are based upon superstition or mysticism or some other ideas that were brought into it, that now when we have a better understanding of the universe and how our cosmology really is, then you do have to wonder, like, what happened there? You see? And so we can get as far as agreeing, or I'm willing to concede that perhaps the gospel authors, when they wrote what they wrote, they were genuine in their beliefs, but were they right? The conclusions that they wrote.
But do we have a right?
And it doesn't have to be some conspiratorial thing. It could have started with just Paul. Paul could have had a quote unquote vision of the resurrected Jesus. And it couldn't have necessarily been like a vision, like actually the God appearing in body form, but just some vision, a hallucination. It could have been something that back during those times they would have interpreted as something miraculous and true, and not a figment of your imagination. And then from that honest testimonial, out comes this whole belief in that, there's someone that at least conquered death, and his name is Jesus.
But you would agree that with Paul, he went back to Jerusalem eventually, and he spent time with the other apostles, like Peter and John and James, and they accepted him. So he ended up, if all he had was some hallucination or some vision and not a real experience, why is it that he ended up teaming up with the very people that had the physical connection and feeling and touching of Jesus after the resurrection? And he like, if he had his own unique experience, he should have started something like Muhammad did. Should have started his own form. But he ended up actually teaming up with the already established belief system about Jesus that was before him, being Cephas, James, John, and the others that were still in Jerusalem. He didn't start his own brand of Christianity, or he didn't start a nuanced vision, because that happened a lot. I think you know that people claim to have these visions, and then all of a sudden this new movement of Christianity started over here, and this movement over here, and this movement over here. I mean, and then you have Islam, and then you have, modern day, you go to Joseph Smith and all the stuff that he saw. So isn't it odd to you that Paul didn't start some new branched thing off of his vision? His vision took him back to the historical narrative the apostles were already teaching before him, and he teams up with them and becomes a instrumental piece to the gospel proclamation that they were preaching before him. and helping them carry that message out, and with them dying the same death. Well, he actually died a little better. He got beheaded, but looking at him, he didn't start a new form of Christianity off of a vision that others claim to have done, because plenty of people did that. His vision, if you would, which he never said it was a vision, he obviously believed it to be a real experience. If that was all it was, how come it led him back to the earlier attestation of the testimony and teachings of Jesus that the other apostles had already been teaching, that he was putting them in prison and killing them for?
I mean, I'm not sure. That's where, I mean, that the situation could be. It's a very complex situation.
Okay.
But it's still, I mean, the fact still remains that a resurrection isn't something that occurs, something that we're aware of, as to be able to trust what someone claims to have seen just because it's written down somewhere, and there's a tradition of people that accepted it as true. It's too extraordinary to just take the written report as evidence, sufficient evidence to accept something like that.
Well,
if the claims were that he did things that human beings can do and have done in the past, then that'll be a different story. But it doesn't seem to be that way.
Well, there's other resurrection reports outside of Jesus himself that even Jesus's critics would recognize. Like John 11, he resurrected Lazarus, who was dead for 4 days. The Jews didn't deny the resurrection nature of Lazarus. I mean, so even outside of Jesus' own resurrection, Paul used that argument against the Jews. He's like, you all sit here and accuse me because I believe a guy resurrected from the dead. Does not our theology teach that God was going to resurrect people from the dead? So to me, the resurrection was a predictive case. I mean, it wasn't like an unexpected thing, like, whoa, we didn't see that coming. One, Jesus said it was going to happen before it happened anyway. He predicted his own resurrection. The prophets predicted his resurrection. The resurrection was already an idea that was being built long before Jesus even came on the scene. So for it to be predicted to happen as such, to me, also builds more. I don't think there's a single case that proves the resurrection. Like, I don't think just the documents alone can prove the resurrection. I think there has to be other factors, which again, that's another discussion for another day. We're on the 2-hour mark, but there are other factors. I mean, the body itself, for example. Second thing, the body was not protected and put in the jurisdiction of his followers. His followers had no control over the body. It was under jurisdiction of Rome. I mean, there's multiple aspects there, but also the predictive nature of resurrection. Going back to the Old Testament, which Peter used as proof. Like, y'all act like this is some sort of surprise to you or something. This was said long before. I mean, and then Paul doing the same thing. Like, why are you guys all getting mad at me for preaching this guy came back from the dead? Your whole theology. And then he turned the Sanhedrin against themselves because the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection and the Pharisees did. And he got himself out of it by being smart. He turned a debate against them. So the idea of a resurrection was not just a surprise. No, go ahead.
Let me kind of go in there. So I actually think that them sort of like acting that way is, if anything, is evidence of the contrary, because I would argue that by the first century, the expectations of a resurrection and some sort of apocalyptic Messiah figure to come were very much part of the world back then. The concept of, you're right, the concept of resurrection was already around. But my question is not, my problem is not, does that exist at all, but did it actually take place with regards to Jesus himself? Because the resurrection was said to happen, for example, of every pharaoh that died, that he would resurrect and be, elevated to the realm of the gods, from which he would continue ruling as God Horus. But do we have any evidence of set pharaohs from resurrecting, and that being a thing. Not really. So why should we treat this claim any differently?
Do we have like the pharaohs or Romulus? Do we have the extended connection of eyewitness report to those accounts that we do of Jesus? Because if they're predictive, I agree. That's why I say it's an accumulative case that builds. It's not one single piece like, well, that's it. That settles everything. I don't believe it's one single piece that does that, because things about Jesus would have had to be, in my opinion, it's not just the resurrection. To me, that's the final straw. Like if Jesus is the Messiah that was predicted to have come and accomplish A, B, C, D, etc., he would not just have to fulfill the criteria of resurrection. There's a lot of criteria before resurrection that would have to lead you to believe that that part of it would be true too. One, his appearance. Two, his connectivity to the bloodline families. And we see this even in Qumran, like the...
I push back on that one.
Go ahead.
I don't, why would you say that? Well, I don't know. I know why, because the Gospels include Joseph as in the genealogy of Jesus, but I think that's an illegitimate claim to the tribe of Judah.
Which you talking about,
part of the
Matthew or
Gospel
Luke?
writers? Either one, because the belief was, or the teaching is, that Jesus was conceived miraculously of the Holy Spirit. So therefore, Jesus, as a Jewish boy, cannot claim lineage to any tribe of Israel because he didn't have a physical Jewish father. So to include Joseph there is sort of it's kind of a mistake.
Well, he was
Tribal
his
lineage
legal
is passed down through the father.
Well, he was his legal father, and his mother was a part of that same tribal group as Joseph was. They were marrying within their tribal groups. And it was actually, it's very argument that it was actually Mary's lineage in one of the Gospels, not Joseph. But going into...
And that one's wrong too, because tribal lineage doesn't get passed down from the mother. The mother is irrelevant. Sure. The mother is only relevant in terms of Jewishness. Like if you're born of a Jewish mother, you're born a Jew. But in terms of tribal lineage, it's only through the father, and that's basically Levitical law right there. And there's even an example in the book of Numbers, I think it's chapter 33, and where it talks about there's a case where it's all girls, and they're wondering, we're all girls, we're not going to get the inheritance, and it'll be lost, and where will the land go? And basically, Yahweh's response to Moses is they either have to marry somebody from within their own tribe, otherwise they're going to lose their land. And that's part of the argument why tribal lineage, which is directly tied to the land that you own, right? Like if you're part of a tribe, you are assigned a certain region.
Yes.
It's those things come together, and so I think that in part of the gospel authors, they're kind of making a big mistake there.
Yeah, but what you're saying, you said that the women are irrelevant. They're not irrelevant. They still have inheritances within that, but they cannot be validated unless they are married into the tribal linkage, which is exactly why she married Joseph the way that she did. She still has her family connectivity. She still has her family history. She still has her family inheritance, as little as it probably was. But none of that stuff can be validated for the woman apart from the marriage, because otherwise she's only going to be able to receive that through her father. That doesn't make Jesus less physically a Judah descendant. He was physically born from a woman of Judah. It doesn't make his bloodline any less Judah. The thing about Jesus, that the foretelling of a virgin birth, if you would, or the Immaculate Conception, which I wouldn't even use that terminology, but just say the virgin birth, for example, that was also predictive. I mean, just the concept of Genesis 3 was mysterious in nature by itself, that the woman would produce seed, because what you just said is exactly right. The woman in of herself does not have this inheritance of the land or rights apart from A, her father, or B, being passed on to a husband. And if she's a widow, she had to marry somebody else in the next ascendancy, like what you see with Ruth, the nearest kinsman, to benefit the inheritance that comes with that by the sealing of a marriage. But that even of itself goes back to the whole, what does it mean that this seed of the woman is going to come? Seed doesn't come from the woman. Seed comes from the man. The ancestral patriarch brings the humanity into it. And you start seeing the prophets build this out like Isaiah does. Isaiah brings out the idea that this young woman would conceive, and that this child in its development, if you follow his pattern, he's clearly not utilizing it just as a young woman, although he applied it, I think, to a physical woman at that time, Ahaz's soon-to-be wife. But that child that she bore would become Hezekiah. But Hezekiah himself could not be that seed either, because he failed to be the very thing that the next description of him would be, that he would be the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. He couldn't be those things, and he failed to be those things, as great as a warrior was. So it's like that even Isaiah began to develop this idea of, what does it mean to predict a Messiah that comes from the seed of the woman? Well, it's going to be virgin born, which, by the way, is why it's very interesting to me that Matthew uses the Hebrew translation of every Old Testament passage, save when you get to the part there in a virgin would conceive. He made sure to use the Septuagint version of that, because that is clearly defining that it was a virgin, not just a young woman, because he clearly understood that to be this developmental side that goes back from Isaiah to Genesis 3. So the idea that a virgin would produce a child to be the deliverer was not some unique, like, well, this just happened and they made this up in the first century when Jesus was around and started. Mm-hmm. This was already predictive too. And that's why I said, you have to go back to so many things. Like, could Jesus have accomplished all that the prophets said that he would do, like his death? Is it just coincidental that he, out of control of his own death and his execution, died on the exact hour that Passover lamb was being killed? He was buried on unleavened bread. He resurrected the same time the Jews celebrated Feast of First Fruits. The Spirit came on the Pentecost. How is it that all of these things just so happened on the very time and hour that Jesus had no control over from a human standpoint? Things happened exactly. They parted his garments and cast lots. Like, how did these things happen exactly the way they said they would?
Yeah, but that's only if you assume that they were written down like someone actually did, like a news reporter went back after this at the scene of the crime and listed all the things that happened. You've got accountants that are saying this happened and this is to fulfill this, and oftentimes it'll include a citation from the Old Testament, right, and think that that's somehow sufficient enough. But I don't know. I actually beg to differ. I've done one episode at least where I talk about Isaiah 7:13 in the translation of Alma, and how within that context, and maybe by the first century there was already sort of like reinterpretations of what that meant, but at least in the scripture, in the context of the scripture itself, to translate that word to describe a virgin, it doesn't make sense.
Well, it does, because she was, if it would have been Ahaz, who was not yet, clearly there's some young girl there that Ahaz was perhaps espoused to. And at that point, she was a virgin, and that she would conceive, not through but she did have a child. So Alma does mean young woman, but obviously it had greater meaning, because that child could not be the sign that God was giving, because Hezekiah did not fulfill. Hezekiah's descendant did. His descendant all the way down to Jesus can be proved to have done what Isaiah said would be done. But Hezekiah didn't do the sign that Ahaz was told it would be done for him there. And that was
what sign do you think that was supposed to be?
Oh, it was clearly messianic.
But what actual sign?
A virgin conceiving.
What was the sign according to Isaiah?
A virgin conceiving.
Well, that's Matthew's interpretation. I disagree with Matthew. I think that the sign that Isaiah was referring to was the maturity of the boy that was soon to be born. And the Gospel of Matthew he quotes Isaiah, but he changes the tense to make this new message fit. Because if you look at the actual Hebrew, it says, and I'm relying by memory right now, I'll be happy to show you a slide in the future. It says that the woman is with child, like it's already in the cow present, like it's already happening.
Yeah.
So to affirm that a woman is already pregnant and at the same time affirm that she's a virgin is kind of a contradiction.
Yeah, but
Matthew changes the tense and says she will have a child, and she will call his name Emmanuel, which poses other problems, but I'm telling you, like, there's some differences in the tense that make it not work.
But you're saying Matthew did this, but the Septuagint translated it as virgin hundreds of years before Matthew. These are Jewish translators of the Hebrew text Alma, and they clearly understood it the same way Matthew did. And they are not a part of they have no reason to conspire or create some narrative of Jesus of Nazareth. He wasn't born yet. They were doing this in the 3rd century BC. They translated it the same way Matthew did.
You're talking about the Greek Parthenos, right?
I'm talking about the Greek Septuagint.
Well, yeah, the word Alma gets translated as Parthenos, which is what would seem an equivalent of virgin.
Yes, it is.
But during the 2nd century BC or so, the word Parthenos didn't necessarily have such unique or exclusive meaning. It was a word that had a little more, there was a little more ambiguity in terms of what it actually meant. It depends on also, as it is with many words, it depends on the context that it's used. But regardless, the word Alma in the Hebrew, which is what we would all agree is the original language or the inspired language of the Old Testament,
sure,
should not be translated as virgin. And like I said, even if it would be in some instances,
it is in some instances in Hebrew. Even Alma can be referred to a virgin woman. In multiple places it does.
It can, but only in the sense that it's coincidental or assumed that because the girl is young that she could also indeed be a virgin. But in the case of Isaiah 7:13, it cannot, because it says that she is already with child. So if she's already with child, that means she's no longer virgin. That implies sexual intercourse.
Which proves the point that it couldn't have been her. And that's what I'm saying, that there's no way
a virgin.
Hezekiah could have never been the fulfillment of what was being said there. He was a piece of the fulfillment. He was the process beginner of that fulfillment. He was not the fulfillment. The sign was not just like a 5-second thing. It was something that was completed over a period of time. And again, Jesus is connected back to that same discussion because Hezekiah is a Davidic king, bloodline Jew that breaks us down into the whole lineage thing again there. But I mean,
it gets a little confusing with Hezekiah, because I think originally Isaiah is referring not about Hezekiah. He's talking about Isaiah's own son.
Yeah, and we differ on that. And there's
Maher Shalal Hasbas.
Yeah,
and it has to do with his maturity, and by the time that King Ahaz will be rescued from Jerusalem from being destroyed. The Hezekiah thing is much later.
Well, there's split opinion on whether it's talking about Isaiah's son or whether it's talking about Ahaz's son there. And I don't know if anybody, especially in Christendom, is ever going to solve that issue of debate. I land on the side that it was actually talking about Hezekiah. I don't think it has anything to do with Isaiah's child, because Isaiah's child cannot be even more so the fulfillment of that in chapter 8 of Isaiah in of itself. It doesn't even work with what message he was giving there. But I do recognize that is even a point of contention amongst Christian scholars about whether or not it was Isaiah's son, Ahaz's son, and Isaiah there. There's no doubt. I land on the side that says Ahaz, his son. I don't think it is in reference to Isaiah's. But again,
maybe we can revisit that in the future.
Sure. Yeah. It's a good discussion here. And we're way over our mark that we said we would be. That's because we probably have a lot we want to talk about. But but I do appreciate you coming on, and it was good to meet you. I realized that you have a journey, and you've studied your perspectives on these things, and I appreciate you taking the time to share that even on this channel. I realize we were originally supposed to be on a different channel. It wasn't planned on being here, so I appreciate you sharing it on ours. And I want you to hear me say this. Some of your concerns with Scripture, the Gospels, I share. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say, man, everything you said is just absolutely ridiculous. This is easy. We could solve it in 5 seconds. One discussion will fix that for you, kind of situation. I don't believe that. I happen to believe that some of this stuff is complex, and it requires a lot of work to build arguments. And I don't think that's true of just my position. I think it takes work to build arguments on both positions. We're all looking at the evidence. And I appreciate the fact, and I hope that you feel this way on our show and our program, that we welcome the disagreement. We welcome the difference of an opinion. We don't look at people that are looking at the same evidence and come to different conclusions as dumb or stupid or something like that. We recognize that this is a very difficult situation when it comes to all of the data that is played out there. We land on the side that the correlation from the earliest attestation, we start with the fact the texts themselves can be relied upon from eyewitness sources, and then we build our arguments from there. I realize that you have issue with many of those aspects, but I do appreciate the fact that you realize that there are some that are like undeniable, or things that are, clear, or they make sense, and it would make sense that this would be accurate in places. I'm glad you're not one of those that just waves their hand over the whole thing and says none of it is trustworthy, none of it is accurate. We should just, you sound like you're more. It sounds like you're kind of closer to maybe where Dr. Ehrman is. Am I wrong?
Quite so. Yeah, I'm not quite a mythicist, nor do I. And maybe at first, I'll be honest, I think at first when I started sort of like uncovering some of these problems, I was like, oh man, these people just like conspire and all that. But no, not really. I think that I've been able to mature in that sense, and realize that perhaps it's not like they tried to do things. It's not like they just made stuff up. It's not like they just conspired this new religion on us, but really it's very possible that the New Testament simply reflects the views and the beliefs of a certain people and a message that caught on, and it was supported and promoted by a very powerful empire at some point, and it became very popular. And it's the current paradigm that we are in right now. It's just the first. It's not the only one, and we should hold this one with as much scrutiny and demand a high level of evidence as we would from other belief systems.
Yeah, and believe me when I say that part of Explore Christianity, one of the things that we do is we have repackaged a lot of the way that the church has simplified the presentation of Jesus' life, ministry, and the gospel and the epistle texts. I think that Christianity has done a disservice to its people by oversimplifying everything. And I really think that we've hid a lot of knowledge for fear of what people do with it. I think that churches have refused to talk about certain issues of controversy, like possible contradictions. We've done that because we're protecting something, or we don't want people to know that, because if they know that, then if they question that, then what if they question this and this and this? And I admit to you that in Christianity, we have done a horrible, horrible job of dealing with the content, the data. One of the things that we're trying to do, Explore Christianity, is actually not hide it. We're actually trying to put it out there and say, yeah, these books of the Bible were debated. Yes, Matthew does say there are two maniacs of Gadara, and Mark focuses on one. Like, we're not hiding anything. Like, our perspective is, let's get into that. Let's talk about that. So I agree with you, from that perspective, that it is complex and we do need to look at it, and we look at it critically as well. Any last words you want to put out there?
No, I mean it's been fun. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to have this informal yet lively and very academic conversation with you, Stephen. I really look forward to happening again one more time. And
Sure.
thank you for
Yeah.
inviting me here to your platform, and thank you, audience, for sticking around to hear what we have to say.
Yeah, thank you for joining me, and hopefully, yeah, this won't be the last conversation we have. I'd like to continue this dialogue. It was really good, really healthy. Thank you again for joining. All right, thank you for everybody tuning in. I know that went longer than we expected, but it was some good discussion. Thank you for Mark joining with us. I trust that it was an encouragement. Once again, check us out in the content. He's got things at the bottom of there for his YouTube channel. And obviously you're on our YouTube channel, but you can find more about us on explorechristianity.net right there at the bottom of your screen. It's also in the content as well. Grace and peace to you. We trust the Lord will give you a happy Easter tomorrow. May God bless.